Before you got into politics, you ran the Congressional Oversight Panel that was in charge of overseeing the $700 billion TARP bailout that Congress approved after Wall Street crashed in 2008. In that capacity, you kept a close watch on where the money was going and found out that large chunks of it were not being used well. So now we have a $2 trillion coronavirus bailout and assistance bill, and it contains a $500 billion fund. Representative Katie Porter calls it a slush fund that the Trump administration will use any way it wants to dole out money to big corporations now in distress. Given your experience, what oversight should be done right now to make sure taxpayers and workers are not ripped off in this process? Can you give us your top 3 tips?
So it's a great question, David. If I can we back up just a tiny little bit?
Sure.
About the bill that passed last week, because I think of it as a bill in 4 parts. Part 1 is get money into hospitals and community health centers. A very good thing to do. Mm-hmm. Part 2 was the expanded unemployment, expanded in who's covered, gig workers, part-time workers, self-employed people, and how many dollars they get. Very good thing to do in a crisis like this. Part 3, get help into small businesses. And condition that help on their keeping people employed. They get a lot more help if they can keep people employed, even if they can't. Get them help so they'll be able to restart their businesses once they can. 3 really good things, and then we hit part 4. And that is a $500 billion bailout to giant corporations. Mm-hmm. And I think Katie's right when she describes it as a slush fund, because it has the potential for Donald Trump and his administration to use this money, to reward their political friends and punish their political enemies. So I spent a lot of time in the negotiations on the first 3 parts, which are all good parts of this bill, but also on that 4th part, to try to get at least some curbs on how the money is spent and some oversight. And I just got to tell you, we improved it. We got a little bit more oversight than the original version of the bill, but not nearly enough. And the Republicans basically just said, this is going to be the price of getting money to our medical providers, getting money to people who are unemployed, getting money to small businesses, is you're going to have to go along with all this money that is available as a slush fund for these giant corporations. Now, given that that's the case, you ask exactly the right question. What can we do about oversight? The provisions in the bill are weak, which means we're going to have to do this one from the outside, a lot of what gets done. You know, you rightly pointed out back when I was doing the Congressional Oversight Panel back in 2008, 2009, 2010, and you and I talked a lot about it back then. Remember, Congressional Oversight Panel didn't really have a lot of power. Our power came from the fact that we wrote these reports and put them out and talked about it. Now, this is going to be even tougher. Remember, back then, we had a Democratic House, a Democratic Senate, and a Democratic administration after the bailout was passed. And so we got some cooperation. Now the Trump administration has already signaled they're not going to cooperate. So here's what I think we have to do. Here are kind of the top things. Okay. Is we have to be consistent in talking about this every single day. We can't let this just drop off the radar screen. And, then suddenly someone says, hey, by the way, these, giant corporations are getting all this money, taxpayer money. We got to stay after it every day and remind people that the slush fund exists and that the public is still interested and paying attention. So that's going to be part 1. Part 2 is we got to dig in to individual pieces about this. I'm doing this with my Senate staff. We've already set up our team to go after it again every single day, to talk about bits and pieces and to tease out what information we can. And we're going to keep doing that. I've already sent 2 letters to Secretary Mnuchin about oversight and about how he spends this money. I want to keep talking about that. And I think part three behind this is when particularly bad stories arise, we've got to be willing to elevate them. We've got to be willing to get out and point out to people, this is taxpayer money, money that could have been used for personal protective equipment, for our healthcare professionals, money that could have been used to help support small businesses, money that could be used to help people who are unemployed. So I think making the case, if there are instances of misuse of this money, really hammering on it, because all of those are the best way to influence how the money gets spent going forward. And that's what we really have to stay after.
Well, let me ask, how will we know where the money's going? Will you know in advance of any grants or money going out, or will we only see this after the fact and when it's too late to prevent it or get the money back?
Right. You have to think of it this way. You're right. I wanted to know about it in advance, couldn't get it into the bill. And you better believe the Trump administration is not going to give us that information going forward. But they are required by law to give us the information on a pretty tight schedule afterwards. 7 days to the Senate after a transaction, after money has gone out, and 14 days publicly. I think of this as you jump on every piece of information that comes out because it influences the next decision that gets made. You know, if they make one bad decision and nobody pays much attention, nobody cares, you better believe the next decision will be worse and the one after that will be worse. So even though it's after the fact, don't think of it as, oh, what can we do? Remember, we're in a repeating environment here. It's not one and done. It's going to be multiple instances of money going out. That's what makes it so critically important to pay attention to every detail of the first time it goes out, the second time it goes out, the third time it goes out, and do what we can to bring as much public pressure to bear on that.
But to be clear, the money is there now in this piggy bank, and there's nothing really one could do to put a stop on it should we find out that the money is not being used effectively. Is that correct?
That's right. That's effectively right. The curbs are so minor in this, and there's so much discretion that has been lodged with Donald Trump's own Secretary of the Treasury, who was a big fundraiser for Donald Trump. And that's going to be a real problem. It's why I worry about, for example, whether or not the money's going to be used to help political friends and punish political enemies. Whether or not the money is going to be used. Look, there are no curbs that say the money has to be used to help support employees, to keep payroll up. No restrictions like that. So that's the kind of thing that we're really going to have to stay on top of going forward.
So Trump and Mnuchin and whoever else is involved can really make any decision on the basis of anything if they claim it's helping.
That's right, except as they worry about public opinion. And we've seen for a long time they don't seem to care much about public opinion, and yet they do, right? That if you get enough pressure, then they really start to care. That's true. And I just actually, can I make the story even worse?
Oh, go ahead.
We talk about this as a $500 billion. Right. But the truth is, it's a lot more than that because they're going to be able to leverage that money. This is actually going into a Fed loan facility. Mm-hmm. And the dollars that we appropriated in Congress are the first loss dollars. So it means, in effect, that the money out of this fund, this $500 billion fund, will go into the first part of the loan agreement. Then the rest of the money will come out of the Fed because it's now secured money behind it, or at least regarded as more secure. The consequence of that is, the best estimate is they actually have about $4 trillion to play with. Think about that. It's like a whole federal budget that they can hand out where they want to hand it out. And meanwhile, we have hospitals that are struggling. to keep their doors open, to keep personnel, to be able to buy the equipment they need, and states and municipalities. So the first letter I sent to Secretary Mnuchin after this bill passed was to say, before you start spending money on giant corporations, you could also spend this money. It turns out that the statute also says they could send it to states and municipalities. State of Massachusetts, for example, has already predicted that we're going to have about a $3 billion shortfall. And unlike the federal government, state of Massachusetts cannot deficit spend and cannot print its own money. So this is going to put a real squeeze on states that are trying to keep people employed, that are trying to meet the services that are needed, both healthcare services and housing services and other demands, and to try to keep all that going. So I'm already pushing Mnuchin to say, make sure first that the states and municipalities are covered, that your local towns are covered, that the cities are covered, before you start spending this money on big corporations. Now, I haven't gotten a reply from him, but David, you understand what this means? At least we've set up the contrast.
Yes.
That wherever those first dollars go, if it's not to our states, if it's not to our cities, you've got the contrast that it was within Mnuchin's direction to be able to do that. And so when Governor Cuomo is complaining about the stress that New York is under, and it is, I mean, he's exactly right to complain. I'm very worried about New York. He could get help from Secretary Mnuchin, and it's a point worth continuing to drive home. The statute has already allocated the money. Mnuchin could use the money for political purposes, for example, or for purposes of helping out shareholders and not employees. But he also has the discretion to use that money to help our states and local governments. He also has the discretion to put real constraints on how he uses the money. So he's got that much discretion. Let's stay after him to use it for good instead of in other directions.
Now, during the TARP bailout, you produced all these reports on a pretty consistent basis every month or two, whatever it was, that told us in real time, close to real time, what was happening. Are we going to see anything like that with this bailout? Or is that something that you're going to do from your office? Is anything that was set up by the bill that will do anything of that nature?
So I don't know yet, David. You could. That is, it was pretty open-ended what we decided to do with the Congressional Oversight Panel back in 2008, 2009. And basically, what's in this statute replicates the same powers to the Congressional Oversight Panel. But the people haven't even been named yet. And partly it's going to be up to them. What kind of people are they? Are they really going to be in there and driving for oversight? Or are they going to be folks who check off the box and let it go? I've made this argument for a long time that personnel is policy. Who you get in a job is almost as important as what powers you give to the job. So for me, this is a really important moment to get the right people at the Congressional Oversight Panel so that they will exercise the kind of oversight that the American taxpayer is entitled to have.
So basically, to sum up here, your tips for dealing with the potential corruption or abuse of this slush fund are what you would say for real estate. Instead of location, it's pay attention.
Yes.
It's really just public pressure. There's not a lot of internal structures for dealing with this.
You've got it right. That's exactly right. Think of it this way. We're going to have to do a kind of crowdsourcing oversight here. We're going to have to all pay close attention to what's going on and stay on top of it. And the reason for that is there's so much at stake here. It's so much money that's at stake. I mean, this really affects our economy. If these companies are not able to pay it back or not able to pay it back for a very long time, that's money we could have spent elsewhere. So it's powerfully important for our economy. $500 billion that's appropriated more that they're going to leverage the American taxpayer into. But it's also important for our democracy. If it is the case that a sitting president and his administration can use taxpayer dollars, and I mean lots of taxpayer dollars, to prefer his political friends and hurt his political enemies, then that really undermines the very foundations of our democracy. So oversight is really important, and I urge everyone who cares about our economy and everyone who cares about our democracy, stay engaged, pay attention, pay attention, pay attention.
Okay, let me shift here a little bit. While we have you, I wanted to ask about a letter you and Senator Patty Murray sent to John Bolton in May 2018, when he was the National Security Advisor to President Trump. You were responding to Bolton's decision to remove from the NSC staff the top global health security position. You both noted there were, quote, continuing concerns that the nation and the world are unprepared for pandemic outbreaks or other global public health threats, as the Trump administration was proposing significant budget cuts for pandemic detection and prevention. You asked Bolton to provide you with a staff-level briefing on the administration's global public health work within 2 weeks, and you asked him a number of questions about how the NSC was addressing the issue of global health security. I want to know, did you ever get a reply from him? And did you ever get that staff briefing?
So we didn't get the briefing. We got a sort of generic reply. But you know, David, what that's really about is kind of the heart of why this crisis is hitting so hard right now. Our government has been run for the past 3 years by people who don't believe in government, or at least don't believe in government except to help themselves and their friends. And the consequence of that is that they were willing day after day after day to strip out the people who perform the basic functions of government. And those things matter. Public health matters. It matters every single day. But most people don't pay attention to it. And so part of what Senator Murray and I were trying to do was bring a little attention to this, a little outside oversight about it. And now we see the consequences of having stripped all of those people out of government who could be helping in this pandemic. It also reflects a second problem with this administration, and that's the problem about anti-science. You know, the way that they have pushed scientists out of the administration, not just on the question of climate change, but everywhere, pushed them out of the Department of Agriculture. It's been an administration that seems to believe that if they simply declare it, then it must be fact. And you know, that comes back to bite you in the rear end. And that's what's happened now. They thought they could talk their way around having public health officials talk their way around having scientists who actually said, here's what's going on, and ignore it. And that's how it is that you end up with an administration that ignored this pandemic, even as the data were coming in from around the world, and even as our own epidemiologists and other scientists were saying, we've got a problem and it's going to hit the United States. And of course, now we're paying the price, not just in having locked down our economy, but paying the price in terms of human life. People who will die because of the inaction of our government over the past couple of months and over the past couple of years.
But are you really saying that when two serious-minded senators sent a letter to the National Security Advisor, the president, saying, we want to know more about what you're doing regarding global pandemics? At the time, there was another Ebola outbreak underway. Of course, there was the more serious one a few years earlier. But when you do that, you just get kind of blown off.
You know, David, there's been a lot of that going on during the Trump administration, that we send our letters over and get either no response or minimal responses that really don't address the concerns. And their view has been they can do this with impunity. And look, I want to be fair about this. it's been hard for the public to pay attention to this because there's been so much of it and so much of it going on. This was not an aberration that we didn't get a response on our pandemic letter. We haven't had responses on oversight letters or haven't had adequate responses over and over and over, because this is an administration that seems to think they can continue to act without Congress, and evidently plan to keep right on doing that.
Joe Biden says he wants to have a woman on the ticket. What do you think of that? Would you want to be that woman?
So look, I think it's terrific that Vice President Biden said that he wants a woman on the ticket. I really do. But right now, I'm in the middle of this crisis and in the middle of oversight issues, so I really haven't focused on this. It feels like right now what we all need to be doing is concentrating on both the health aspects and the economic aspects of this terrible crisis that our country's going through. So that's where I've kept my energy and my thoughts for now.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. It's always good to talk to you.